Hello and welcome back to The Conclusion of the Matter. I'm Brent Ferguson. Joined with me, as always, is Robbie Santiago and Ryan Weaver. We're glad that y'all have tuned in. Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. Let us hear the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or evil. As always, we try to look at what the scriptures say and only take from them what God intended for us to know and to understand, and what he meant by what we see in Scripture, as we should do with everything in Scripture. And so we're going to be doing that today with a couple of interesting chapters, I think, from a listener-requested topic. But before I hand it over to Robbie, just remember, if you have any comments, questions, or suggested topics, feel free to email us, message us on Facebook, reach out to us personally, email us personally. If you have our emails, there's 101 different ways to get in touch with us, so leave a comment.
Similar to the Dalmatians.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know what edit I'm doing today.
Oh, I'm sure everybody will enjoy that one.
But
For once, I'm not on the end of that.
Hopefully it's a Dalmatian and not Cruella de Vil. But anyway.
Well, I was going to do a Dalmatian,
Okay,
but now
you might.
We're actually this episode and next episode are going to be our season finale. It's hard to believe that season 6 is already coming to an end, but we're going to take a break for the summer, and we'll be back either in June or July. We haven't quite been able to figure out.
July or August.
Oh yeah, July or August. Sorry. We haven't quite been able to figure out when that's going to be, just because of different scheduling conflicts and things like that. But we'll come back either late summer, August, somewhere in there. But I guess I'll hand it over to Robbie.
All right. Well, thanks, Ren. I'm back in the saddle. Fortunately, Lucas and I did not get the stomach bug, but that's where I was last week.
What does that say?
Yeah. So we had we do this auction at school every year, and one of the this wasn't really an event per se, but something they told us that we needed to do was they got all the men together, and so instead of MCS, it's MenCS, and they made us do a bunch of
That's not how I would have read that.
stuff.
Me either.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyway,
Okay.
but that's basically what it was. It's kind of like making music or spring sing,
Okay.
but a much, much, much shorter and very, very watered down, and with actual songs instead of made up lyrics and stuff.
Okay.
But anyway, some of y'all are like, what is spring sing and making music? So look it up on YouTube, I guess.
Yeah.
But anyway, back in the saddle, and Mr. Clean over here kicked me off of the podcast last week for a week. But it's good to be back, and today we're going to be talking about some of my favorite topics.
Mr. Clean's bald, but you're not talking about me,
No.
right?
He's
No, I'm
talking
talking
about
about the germaphobe over here. Is like, yeah,
Hey,
well,
look.
hey, honestly though, I probably wouldn't blame you either, because
You
ain't
wouldn't
nobody
blame
got time
me. You're
for the
blaming
stomach.
me right now. What are you talking about?
Yeah, well,
Are you going to
kicked-
change your edit? That's all I want to know. Are you going to do two
I don't
edits?
know. I don't know. We'll see.
We should go back in.
I'm going to have a
and edit and put picture
Dalmatian
of Mr.
head,
Clean.
and you're going to have a Mr. Clean head because of that comment, I bet.
Yeah. Well, anyway, what were we talking about?
We haven't even gotten to it yet.
Well, we're about to. So one of my favorite topics in a general sense is just kind of historical accuracy of the Bible. So we're going to be looking at a couple of those on this podcast today, but we're going to be mostly out of Daniel chapter 2. And probably one of the most historically accurate prophecies that we point to that's a little bit more common for people to know about. But I don't know where you guys wanted to begin, but I was just going to go ahead and jump down to kind of where the dream is interpreted in Daniel chapter 2, beginning in verse 31. And a little backstory to this: King Nebuchadnezzar was the king of the Babylonians, also called the Chaldeans, probably in most of your translation, but it's kind of used interchangeably.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there a few hundred or maybe even 1,000 years before the Chaldeans, there was also another group called the Babylonians, for like Hammurabi's code and that type of Babylon. They're technically two different groups, but they both were called Babylon. But technically the one that Nebuchadnezzar was in charge of were the Chaldeans. So, but sometimes those labels kind of get thrown in together. But he was the king of Babylon at the time, and it's the same king that God humbled by basically making him a cow for about 20 years, I believe. So same Nebuchadnezzar there, but we're not going to be getting much into that, I don't believe, today.
Chapter 4, if you guys want to
I
read
think
about
chapter
it.
4.
Yeah, you can read a couple chapters later. Spoiler alert for that. But verse 31 says, "You saw, O king, and behold a great image. This image, mighty and of exceedingly brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of its image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold altogether were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation." Before we go on to the actual interpretation, I wanted to see if you guys had any comments, whether in a broad sense or even on a specific part.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that the things that I think we'll get to at the end, when Nebuchadnezzar is told this, he gives Daniel's God credit. And as you would see if we would read really the middle of the chapter there, where he had asked all the magicians and the Chaldeans and interpret this, and depending on the translation, which I did it, we studied Daniel in the auditorium class, and I did chapter 2, and I found it interesting because depending on your translation, some translations say that he forgot the dream, and other translations it just says, tell me what it means.
Yeah.
And it's like either way, when Daniel told him what it was, he must have had some recollection of it to know that it was legit. But his point was, you need to tell me what it is, and then interpret it.
Right.
And they're like, no, you tell us.
Right.
The magicians were like, no, you tell us. Well, I mean, it makes it more impressive if you can tell me.
Well, because I've always kind of thought of it as like a test.
Yeah, I did too.
Do you actually know?
Exactly.
Can you actually do this?
Now, it could be the other way where he couldn't remember everything, but then Daniel did mention things. He's like, I do remember. But anyway, either way, we see where Daniel goes in, and I just had it here, and then I scrolled up too far. But what I found interesting was verses 17 and 18. He went to who most people would call Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and he told them to do what? He told them in verse 18, seek mercy from God of heaven concerning this mystery, so Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men. Daniel knew who could do it.
Yeah.
And he found the value of, hey, we're going to pray to God and he's going to help us do this. But he not only did it on his own, but guess what? I think there's a lesson there for us hidden in the fact that, asking people to pray for us and with us is a big benefit.
Yeah.
But I know that has nothing to do with
No, that's a good point.
the vision in and of itself, but the backstage is the king's made an edict. If you can't tell me this, you're dying.
Yeah.
And it's not only you can't tell me, but then you can't tell me what it means.
Right.
And I think that's all the more impressiveness of this is that Daniel. I was thinking David, but Daniel was able to tell him what it was and what it means, which we're going to get to, but it wasn't because of his own ability.
Right.
And I think that's what, sorry, Ren, that you kind of get to in the middle of the chapter here, on verse 20, that he starts with giving God credit and really relies on him to, obviously without God, that he wouldn't have been able to interpret this. He would have been just like the other ones. And Ren, I agree with you that I think it seemed like it was more of a test for the wise guys, particularly, I think.
The wise guys.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to call them. At the end of 18 that you brought up, Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon.
Yeah.
I think this was kind of a test, at that time, whether you're talking about the king of the Chaldeans or even later the Persians and some of the other powerful groups that are going to come and go in power, some of which the dream mentions. But if you're speaking to the king and you're trying to, basically trick him, or if you're a fraud, essentially, you're probably going to face death. And so this was a test that it's not like in 2020 where, I would say most people don't believe in like actual like magic and witchcraft and things like that. But at the time, even up until like the colonies and stuff, there was a lot of, people that were tricked and believed those kind of things.
Yeah.
Real quick before you go, Ren, verse 8 in the King James is where it says, the king answered and said, I know of certainty that ye would gain the time because ye see the thing is gone from me. That's where they get the idea that
he forgot it.
He forgot it.
Yeah.
I think it also could be a little bit of both too.
Either way.
Because it could also be, because the first part of that, it seems like he's saying you're trying to delay, like you're trying to buy time.
Time, yeah.
Because I've made this edict that you're going to die if
That's
you don't
how
get this.
I think the ESV reads it, but then the King James and I think another version throw in this has left me or So that's where I'll be honest, the reason why it stuck with me is because when I was looking at the Winton commentaries, it says the forgotten dream. I'm like, what do you mean forgotten? Because I'm reading now the English Standard at that time, and but anyway, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to bring up, because when you first started talking a minute ago about Daniel interpreting the dream, which this might have been what you were referencing earlier, Robbie, but verses 26 through 28 is where Daniel even tells Nebuchadnezzar. He says it's not the wise men, it's not enchanters, magicians, none of them can do it, only God can do this. And so
the wise guys.
Yeah, the wise guys. Makes me think of the Three Stooges.
Well, they were kind of stooges in one sense, but
the only other thing I was going to bring out, which we might highlight this more as we go and dissect each of these parts, but the imagery that is used in this vision, I think, is interesting, because as you go down through this list, you start with a very precious metal, but it's very fragile, and then the next metal, it's a little less valuable, but it's a little bit stronger of a metal. And then the third metal, it's less valuable still, but stronger. And then the final metal of iron is the least valuable of the four, but the strongest. And so I think that's an interesting comparison that's going to be made to these different groups throughout the prophecies.
Right. I was going to bring up the same point. I think that was completely intentional too, and also I think even from perhaps even a wealth standpoint too. And you think of Babylon, most people don't know a ton about like Babylon itself, whether like the first one or the Chaldeans. But they had a lot of like incredible like advancements and world wonders, most notably like the Hanging Gardens, and even a lot of their leaders, including my favorite one, Nimrod. But all that to say, as we get further down the line, the empires do become stronger, and I wouldn't say that the last one is necessarily less valuable, but especially in terms of military might, or even like kind of what the focus of each of them kind of was, I think. The first two seem to be a lot more kind of focused on wealth and not necessarily expansion, but more kind of like advancement and cultural kind of aspects, and especially the second one. But anyway, Ryan, anything else before we move on to the kind of interpretation part? Okay, well, we'll pick up in verse 37 here. You, O King, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all. You are the head of gold. So we'll pause there. The first one, he's talking specifically to Nebuchadnezzar. So the Babylonians are representative of the head of gold. And so I'll briefly go back to verse 32. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. So the head of this is representative of the Babylonian Empire, and kind of like Ren already had mentioned, it was a very, very wealthy empire. And were you guys going to kind of get into the part about the symbolicness of the head, or?
Go ahead.
Well, I was just, there's kind of a few interpretations that I read about this. Obviously, this was going to be the earliest of the preceding empires, but it's kind of like that. It was kind of the one that kind of set the tone for the rest of them. And even like there were several empires after this whole area, but through the Middle East, I'm trying really hard not to spoil them. Maybe I ought to save my comment for later. But long story short, there's going to be a lot of empires, including Babylon, and then several of the ones that are going to come after this and even into the future. And empires such as the Ottoman Empire, that's going to be around from about the 1400s until the 1900s at the end of World War I. That this whole area is going to be empire after empire, and the Babylonians, Chaldeans, were really the first one to kind of solidify power in that entire area. You could even throw the Egyptians somewhat into the discussion there. They're not mentioned in the image here, but they have somewhat of a sphere of influence in that area too. But what do you guys have about the Babylonians or the head of gold?
Well, I was just going to make the point that it's interesting that he says that Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. Obviously, Nebuchadnezzar kind of generally represents the kingdom of Babylon, but also if you keep reading in chapter 5, you read of his son Belshazzar. Yeah. And at the end of chapter 5 is where you see Belshazzar, his son, being killed. And the next group of people that we'll look at in this list then assumes power over the Babylonians. And so it's interesting that he gives this, but he tells Nebuchadnezzar that he's the head of gold, and his kingdom is pretty shortly going to be coming to an end. That's all I had.
Anything else?
Add? Not well. Yeah, a little bit. I just don't know if this is the right place to tie it in. And Ren, this was part of. I found it interesting because you were teaching Providence in the Wednesday night class, and we looked at this example. And,
that's what.
What's that?
Go ahead.
Oh,
you reminded me of something.
And stuff that was brought up was because we talked about, not the spoiler alert, but eventually when we get to the end of this, we're going to talk about the kingdom that will never be destroyed. And we see in, where did it go? Galatians chapter 4, that at the fullness of time, and we've talked about in the past all of the things, and you brought up why were all of these, number one, who established these kingdoms? God did, right? And he allowed them to be into power, even though we see that, Robbie kind of alluded to it earlier, but one thing when you look at these kingdoms, ethics and moral kind of declined all the way to the Roman Empire for these, right? Yeah. And but did God use them for benefit? Yeah. Absolutely. And the one that I found interesting was in that class where you were looking for benefits and some of the stuff I'd never thought of before. The one that you had mentioned, I did know, but on a national level, idolatry was pretty much gone. We don't see it anymore now.
From the Israelites,
from the Israelites, right? And to your point, there could have been individuals that still did it, but from a national level, it wasn't a problem anymore. The other one from JewishEncyclopedia.com, which I think Jim had mentioned, but they said that the synagogue as a permanent institution originated probably in the period of the Babylonian captivity, when a place for common worship and instruction had become necessary, which we will see in the New Testament becomes very important for the spread of the gospel. Yeah, I'm talking about the synagogue.
Right. I think I've also heard that might have also been with the next group. Because
I think it became more...
With the next group is when the law was reinstituted and all of that, too.
So anyway. Yeah. I don't know if we want to add those as we get to each group or not.
No, I think we should. Okay. Because that's, as soon as you started talking, that's what it reminded me of.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. But I think that would be a good point to make. Because if we don't do that, it can make this seem a little bit more arbitrary. If we don't understand why God was using these specific kingdoms. Yeah.
That's all I had on at least that part.
Okay.
Anything else before we move on?
Nope.
Okay. Well, we left off here with verse 39. So we'll pick up there. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. So what do you guys have on the bronze part of the image?
Well,
What
we got
about
to
the
do
silver?
Well, silver, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, both bronze.
Yeah.
Well, let's start with silver, I guess. We'll go in order here.
Yeah.
Or do you want me to go first?
Well, it doesn't. Yeah.
You kind of already alluded to
Yeah.
it.
At the end of chapter 5 is where we see this group of people, because we see that Belshazzar was killed, and it says Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being 62 years old. So this is the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire.
And I think some people have you'll read where, well, what about the Median? But the Medes were never really as powerful as the Medo-Persian, and then that whole relationship, marriage. There's somebody that got married in there or something like that. To your point, but then when we get further in Daniel, the Medes and the Persians are mentioned as a joint empire,
and then it becomes pretty much just the Persians.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Most of them even just kind of lump the two and just call them Persia, essentially, historically speaking. But yes, so the Medes, and I don't know if we were going to get into this one. I believe it's in Daniel. I thought it's in chapter 7 that it might mention this, but essentially you had the Medes that come first. I'm almost certain that it's 7 or 8.
8, if you're talking about the goat and the horns.
Yes,
that's
the horns.
8.
So that's chapter 8.
Yeah.
I had it in this book here. I was going to bring up, but anyway, so essentially the Medes come up first, but then there's a second horn that comes up second. That's kind of more powerful and stronger, and so essentially those two combine, and then they're essentially taken over. So I won't spoil too much of that, but like we've kind of been talking about, this is symbolic of the Medo-Persian Empire, or the Persians, or whatever you want to call them, that would be representative of the silver part of the image. And then the kingdom of bronze. And
wait, I want to go back before we move on.
Sure.
Going to the benefits. This is where we see the Jews being allowed to first return back to Jerusalem.
Yep.
And then the other one was they allowed Jews to live in other places of their kingdom in relative safety. So again, contributing in the future to the spread of the gospel by having the Jews spread out, living in a peaceful type setting.
And it's during this time period of the Persians, especially, where you would study like the books of Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah. Are there some others that I'm missing? Probably
I think some of the minor prophets, maybe too.
But those major books,
the major 3.
They depict, especially Ezra, kind of depicts the return from captivity and the rebuilding of the temple and Jerusalem and all of that. Esther, of course, is kind of not really focused on that at all. It's more of delivering them from Haman's genocide. But it all takes place during that Persian Empire.
Yeah, but those are kind of important years, though. Even Esther mentioning like King Ahasuerus or King Xerxes, however you interpret it. I don't know, the translations are different on his name, but they're pretty much used interchangeably. And then I think it's in Isaiah chapter 45 or 49, I forget which it was, that mentions King Cyrus by name, which I found really ironic, because Cyrus,
I think it's 44 and 45.
I believe it's chapter 45. I was going off of the top of my head for that, but Cyrus was probably one of, if not the most important kings of Persia. And I believe Isaiah was written, like off the top of my head, in like 690 BC-ish. And it was like 145 years later that Cyrus becomes the king of Persia. So that's another really good historical evidence of the Bible's accuracy. How could he prophesy about somebody who's not going to live for another, I'm rounding, 150 years. Yeah. So I think that's a really good one. And
it is Isaiah 44 and 45. He's mentioned in both of them.
Cool. And I believe Jeremiah might mention something about him too, but I don't have that one off the top of my head. That might be something different. I was going to throw in a couple of dates too, because the book of Daniel's date is sometimes disputed as to, like some date it is like,
especially chapter 8, they say that it had to be written after the fact and not, they say it's too precise that there's no way you could do it before.
Couldn't have done it. Yeah.
But anyway.
Well, that's like the resurrection. It couldn't have happened.
Exactly. Yeah. So by disputed, outside of Christianity, it's not really, or is really more of the argument here, where they date it somewhere about like 160 BC, whereas the actual book itself, I don't know how it could be 160 BC because Nebuchadnezzar would have been like dead for 400 years. But anyway, I would say most likely it would have been sometime in the 6th century. I would say around 540 BC, 530 BC, but is what most people think, because that's kind of the height of the Babylonian Empire that's mentioned, but also during King Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Nebuchadnezzar reigned from 605 BC to 562 BC. So even, conservatively, 540 BC is 22 years after Nebuchadnezzar's dead and whatnot. I don't know what Daniel's lifetime specifically would have been, how old he would have been at that point, but obviously it would have had to have been sometime within that span for him to be able to be alive to interpret the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar and have this face-to-face encounter. Whereas the book of Daniel is supposedly written in 160 something BC, according to secular sources. But
I think they not only questioned at that point the time, but the author at that point. That's what I've heard, is that if it's a later date, there's no way Daniel could have written the entire book. But
it would kind of make that entire book pretty confusing then. But even the Chaldeans, now these are dates according to Google, so there's not really a specific reference
it's
here.
It's hard to nail them down.
Yeah, they speculate that the Chaldeans, like, these are just historical date for the kingdoms themselves. The Chaldeans were around from about 625-ish BC to about 540 BC. Yeah. So right in that kind of window with Daniel. And then since we mentioned the Persians, we'll get to these other ones later, but the Persians were around from basically the time that the Chaldeans were kind of on their way out, as Daniel's prophesying here, from about 540, 550 BC, all the way up until about 331 BC, about the time that, almost spoiled it, but by the time our next group is going to come onto the scene. So
I was just going to bring up, because you brought up those dates for Babylon, their kingdom ending around 540. The number I've also seen is 539, which that's basically the same thing.
Yeah, plus or minus a year.
Yeah, but I was just going to bring that up because if you look at chapter 9, as Daniel he receives another vision, but he's basically studying. In verse 2, it says, in the first year of his reign, talking about Darius, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Well, that goes back to Isaiah and Jeremiah that talk about the 70 years of persecution and of captivity. Well, that happened in 606 BC, and so Daniel knew that, hey, those 70 years are just about up. We're getting really close to the end of that. And so, again, them ending in 539, the Medes and the Persians come to power, and then Cyrus, the Silver Kingdom that we're talking about, allowed them to return from captivity around 536, which is 70 years.
Yep. Anything else on that one?
Nope.
I had one more. We may get into this in a future podcast, so I'm not going to harp too much on it, but we had mentioned Daniel chapter 8 a number of times, talking about the Persian Empire. Specifically in chapter 8, starting in verse 3, this is the vision that we've been referencing, talking about the Medo-Persians. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. So the first horn being the Medes, second horn, more powerful, but came up last, the Persians. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward, the very directions that the Persian Empire expanded. Spoiler alert. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. And as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes, and came to the ram with 2 horns, which had been seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns, and the ram had no power to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. So I thought this was kind of a good segue in between the two groups here as we transition from the silver part, which was representative of the Persians, who we just mentioned was the Persians, but the Medo-Persians. Yeah. There was a group that came after them that was representative of the goat here. And the goat basically, beats up the ram, for lack of a better way to put it, and completely annihilates it, breaks its horns and whatnot. So this is symbolic of Greece, the next kingdom, specifically talking about Alexander the Great coming in and conquering Persia. Now, not only did that happen, but also during what historically is known as the Persian War, mostly the Athenians and a few of the other groups, but the Greeks had also surprisingly defeated the Persians during that war as well. And that kind of put Greece on the map as kind of like a significant world power, which before Alexander the Great comes on, I'm going to try not to hog the mic here. I may ought to let you guys go first, but essentially Greece had been around for a few hundred years before Alexander the Great comes onto the scene. And you had what was known as the Hellenic period, which was generally known as the Greek Golden Age, if you will. This is when all the cultural advancements and philosophers, all of their cultural heyday with all of their mythology and all of that is starting to kind of develop, spread throughout all of Greece and become pretty prevalent. That was a different time period, and then after that becomes what's known as the Hellenistic period. That word Hellenic just means Greek. Hellenistic, on the other hand, means Greek-like. The reason it's Greek-like is because Alexander the Great was actually from Macedonia, or Macedon. His dad, Philip, was actually the founder of the empire, if you will, but then Alexander kind of takes over after his death. And what his father likely also would have been successful in doing a lot of this. Alexander the Great is arguably, outside of probably Genghis Khan, probably the greatest military general of all time. Maybe you could throw Julius Caesar in that discussion, maybe, but definitely top 5. And so he was technically from Macedon, though, so he wasn't truly Greek. But the Macedonians, as they're spreading their empire, take over Greece, and as they're expanding, they're spreading the Greek culture instead of like Macedonia. So instead of it really being like a Macedonian empire, it's more like Greek culture and everything spreading. But Alexander the Great's the one that does it. So you have this whole time period, even dating back, there were a couple of groups before, like Athens and Sparta, called the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, and then they kind of come and go, and the Greek Dark Ages happen, and then you have Athens and Sparta, and then the Greek Golden Age, Peloponnesian War. Some of y'all are like, what on earth is he talking about? All this stuff happens before Alexander the Great even comes in and Greece begins expanding. Before Alexander the Great, Greece had pretty much kind of just sat there and minded their own business for the most part and fought each other, Athens and Sparta. But Alexander the Great really expands this like as quickly as an empire is probably in history ever spread. And as quick as it expands, it is as quick as it pretty much diminishes after his death as well. And so that's kind of like the few verses in Daniel chapter 8, verse 7 and 8, really. I was
going to mention 22 as well.
I'll save that one for you to get the credit on that one, but
I think it's making the same
verse
same
8.
point.
The goat had become exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns.
Yeah, verse 22 is basically saying the same thing. Because it just says, as for the horn that was broken in the place of which 4 others rose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. Which again, if you back up to verse 20 and verse 21, he specifically mentions that the ram was Media and Persia, the goat is Greece, and the great horn is its first king, which would be considered Alexander the Great. To go to the point that you were bringing up, though, I think it's an interesting point, which goes along with the kind of the benefits or the reason why God used these kingdoms. Though Alexander the Great, as you were talking about, was from Macedonia, they didn't spread Macedonian culture. They spread Greek culture, which inevitably kind of laid the groundwork for a common Greek language, which is really going to come into play in the next kingdom as we talk about that one.
Right. Yeah. It's really hard to not segue. Go ahead.
Well, the
Ryan.
other thing I was going to say along the lines of the language is when the Septuagint was translated. The Old Testament was So a couple things there is it shows that translations are apparently okay.
Yeah. That's the one that Christ used.
Yeah, they say typically Christ and Paul would quote from the Septuagint. So it's a good thing. Because then, I mean, we're all using the originals aren't around, but this was an important time, not only because of the language, but then it started the translation train, I guess you could say.
And a lot of the information, I've got this book called Defender that Apologetics Press puts out, and this is book number 2, and it kind of goes into a lot of this. But even if you don't want to read the whole book, a lot of this is in chapter 8, starting around page 99, that kind of talks about this vision in chapter 8 and breaks it down in a lot more detail than we have time to. But even Daniel's written, we kind of talked about the date that it was written, and essentially this chapter 8's fulfillment happens like over 250 years after Daniel's written. So that's why all of this was, disputed, is because there's such a gap there and it's in such detail. Even after this, I think it mentions that in verse 22 there, maybe a few verses after it, how it's divided into 4 different sections, and it mentions it in the first vision and what I read too. But the empire is going to get divided into 4 parts, and that's going to be kind of like the slow decline of the empire. And eventually one of those 4 is going to kind of be strong for a little bit, but it's going to be really like evil and corrupt and,
Well, that's called out in chapter 8 too.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we don't have time to necessarily get into all of that, but do you guys have anything else about the Greeks?
Well, I was just going to add the 4 kingdoms were Alexander the Great's 4 generals. He left it to them. You can look up their names if you want to. They got some interesting names.
And we probably wouldn't be able to pronounce them very well anyway.
Antigonus and Lysimachus.
Suetonius in there?
No, Suetonius was a historian.
That's right, yeah.
Seleucus.
That's the one I was thinking
of.
Yeah. I believe it was Antiochus or whatever you said that was the one that was really corrupt and became a little bit more powerful.
Yeah.
He's the one, the 4th.
He was given Asia.
Yes, I believe, and he was, I think, the one that mistreated all the Jews or something like that. I read. Anyway, well, back to chapter 2. If you guys are good to go on. Oh, and a date for Alexander the Great. He essentially dies in 323 BC, I believe it is. So you can kind of see the gap between.
He was only 24 years old or something like that, right?
Well, that's what I was saying. His military career, I think he took over. It was either at 16 or 18, I think. I think it was 16. And I mean, he just
had to be just naturally smart.
Yeah, I mean,
one of the Mensa kind of.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, he's probably, if he's not the number 1 military general of all time, he's got to be number 2. And just because he starts at 16 and it's a span of essentially 10 years, or a little bit less than even, and then it's just massive expansion and power, and then it's all just gone. There's a lot of theories and reasons for his death, or supposed reasons, that you can go read about on the internet that we don't have time to get into. But that is essentially, even though the Greek Empire is technically ended by 323 BC or shortly thereafter, their culture was just so widespread by that point because of Alexander the Great's influence, and then each of those regions essentially spread that Greek culture even more, and especially the language that you brought up, because that's going to be really important for our next really 2 groups, depending on how you think about it here. Okay, I believe we left off with verse 40 here. So I'll read 39 just for context. Another kingdom inferior to you shall rise after you, the Persians, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth, the Greeks, Alexander the Great. And then verse 40, and there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. So this is going to be symbolic of the Roman Empire. And Rome was, if it was not known for anything except for its military, it was known for its military. When you think of their legions and centurions and their military might, and obviously their expansion. And when I mention the military, I would say Alexander the Great, in just a short span, was the most accomplished. But Rome was around essentially for for 500 years, and it depends on if you. So the start date for Rome, I believe, again, kind of off the top of my head, is somewhere around 44 BC is when the Republic, I believe, starts, and then it essentially gets taken over by three different groups, most famously the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Vandals, hence the word vandalism. And there's kind of two different dates, one in 476 AD, one in 495. But the next time period is going to be known as the Middle Ages, and I would really like clean numbers for that, and I consider the Middle Ages about 500 to 1500, so give or take, you're going anywhere from about 50 AD to 500 AD, or from 0 to 500. So, but a good long while after the book of Daniel's written. Even if Daniel's written in 160 BC, I mean, you're still looking at, close to 200 years. So, what do you guys have about the Romans?
You have something?
Well, yes. I was going to talk about the benefit. Sorry, I was reading verse 41 about the intermingled clay stuff. But the benefits, I think we've mentioned in the past, the road system, travel, generally peace. The Romans, while they were a military might, they pretty much wanted peace in all of their provinces or whatever you want to call them. One that was mentioned in class that I'd never heard and I thought was very interesting was reduced piracy in the Mediterranean, which becomes pretty important because Paul's missionary journeys was on boats in the Mediterranean, and would have made sense that made it for safer travel, not only on the roads but by ship. So that obviously came into play too. So, and this again came from the providence, when we were talking about the providence and God using these nations for preparing the fullness of time to send Christ to establish his next kingdom.
Right.
But anyway.
Because that's a good point. And just to kind of recap all of those things, the Babylonians kind of eradicated idolatry, and we see the beginning of the synagogues. We see that especially so with the Medes and the Persians, and they're reestablishing the old covenant. Greeks give the language there, and then the Romans give all of those benefits that you just mentioned, kind of all of the perfect scenarios and circumstances that you would, I guess it's as good as you could probably get. And God using all of those kingdoms for those purposes, for his intention.
And it shows his timeline is way different than what we would think.
Yes.
It's like, not that he wasn't powerful enough, but there was some reason that he, in his infinite wisdom, which we've used that term before, it just that he said it was going to happen. He didn't say when it was going to happen, but anyway.
I did want to correct the record. The Roman Republic, when it was first started, when you have first some of their government systems starting to come in place, that was starting around 509 BC. So it's kind of developing even kind of back into the Greek Empire. And I forget when the Punic Wars, I'll look up a date for that too. But then when it becomes an empire, generally is one of two dates, 49 BC, which was the one I was mixing up, and then 27 BC. Essentially, they're associated with Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, 49 BC, crossing the Rubicon River, and essentially becoming the dictator. They told him if you cross this, it's going to be like war. And then he took over all of Rome and, expanded. But the other one was 27 BC, which I believe is pretty much when that process was more or less complete. And so it was kind of like a dictatorship. Now, the piracy one, I think, is kind of important because during the Punic Wars, let's see, the Punic Wars were in about 264 BC until 146 BC. I believe there were 3 of them. And the most famous general during those wars was not even one of the Roman generals. It was Hannibal, who I don't have time to get into his story. I really want to. He was another one that would really be top 5, especially
when you were saying that. That's what I was thinking.
That dude was a dog. Yeah. But, anyway, so the piracy one was a pretty important one because Carthage was kind of like on like the northern coast of Africa, and it wasn't just like a tiny city. Carthage, they had kind of like all of North Africa under their control. And Carthage was actually originally just a Phoenician colony that eventually just dominated that region and was really Rome's main trading and influence rival in that Mediterranean area. So even like long term, Rome's still really like fishy about Carthage coming and taking them over. If the Punic Wars are, I think, overlooked in a lot of like historical context, but it's pretty important for Rome's history. So if you got nothing better to do, then
and with Hannibal too, because in a lot of the reading that I've done about Hannibal, he was one of the few men that Rome actually feared.
They were scared to death.
Like the people in Rome were like, "This is it for us."
That's what I'm saying. Like they're so afraid of like the Carthage, but specifically because of Hannibal. I mean, it was literally this guy was their living nightmare because they had defeated them fairly easily during the first Punic War. I mean, it was pretty intense. And Rome, during all these wars, had overcome a lot of hardships and stuff, and it really showed their kind of like innovativeness and their just ability to adapt. I'm not going to get into too much of it, but basically in the northern part of Italy, you have like you have the mountains, the Alps. Nobody would dare cross the Alps. So Rome was basically, throughout all of their history, they're like, okay, if somebody invades us, it's going to have to be through the ocean because nobody's dumb enough to go through the Alps in the winter. Well, then Hannibal goes all the way around, and then sure enough goes right through the mountains, and pretty much has like a tiny army at that point. But then when they get out, I mean, they just completely just wipe Rome out, even though Rome's armies are like 3, 5, 10 times the size. I mean, Hannibal just completely incredible. Like decimates them with his military tactics. So honestly, if he was on Rome, there's no telling what that could have. Speaking of peace, if Hannibal was in Rome, it probably would have been the opposite of peace for everyone else. He would have been probably more than Alexander the Great, I would say.
But to me, I think Hannibal's so interesting because of how, I guess, his strategic mind and how he was able to put Rome like on its heels, even though his army was so much smaller than Rome's. But yet it wasn't God's plan for him to be in power for the coming of the Messiah. And so it didn't work out for him.
Yep. And if you go back and study that war, especially during the middle of the second and into the third Punic War even, but especially the second, I don't know how that he doesn't, because I mean, he could have really taken over Rome, and just for whatever reason, God was the reason, I guess. But Rome obviously is a pretty familiar empire, starting with Julius Caesar and then getting into technically his adopted offspring, Augustus Caesar, also known as Octavian. And then after him, you have the Caesars dynasty, if you will. And then the most famous empires, or the most famous emperors, or the most successful ones, are generally during a period that's known as the 5 good emperors. And the most famous one of those probably either Hadrian or Trajan. I believe Trajan, one of those two. I think it's Trajan was the emperor when it was the largest. But those are probably some of the main main well-known ones. But eventually, did you guys have anything else on Rome, or is it okay if I kind of segue into our next group? So
Go ahead.
Rome kind of begins to decline around that time, and it's kind of a slow decline. But in 185 AD, you had a Roman emperor known as Diocletian, who comes up with the bright idea like, hey, Rome's kind of been a disaster for a while. What if we kind of split it in half? Because at the time, Rome pretty much had most of Europe, and then also most of kind of like the Mediterranean sphere of influence as well. So the eastern half going out towards like Greece and Macedonia and Eastern Europe, they basically took the eastern half, that became Eastern Roman Empire, and then the western half. Well, then, as I mentioned a while back, Rome kind of had developed a lot of enemies that had come in, including the Vandals and other groups that had come in and wiped them out around 500 AD. The eastern half of the empire, though, everybody kind of left them alone for the most part because it's like, who cares about them? And so they focused just on like the city of Rome and Italy and that sphere and pretty much decimated it. And so all of any kind of like knowledge or writings and things, they were transported to the east to preserve those, or they were destroyed. But over time, the eastern part of the empire became known as the Byzantine Empire. So it really existed as that from about that point of 185, but flashing forward to 500 until they were ransacked by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. So for about another 1,000 years, the eastern half kind of lives on. Now, the eastern half still, because when the split happened in 185, they still considered themselves to be Romans because that's what they were before the split happened. Even though like you get into, the 700s, 800s, 1200s, they still considered themselves to be Roman. So as we go on to verse 41 here, and as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, you see that part of it was Rome, the iron part, and partly clay, the Byzantine part. It shall be a divided kingdom, but some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay. And as of the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mix with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. So you kind of see, they're kind of the same empire, but kind of not. And there's a lot of key differences, even religiously. You have Roman Catholic in the West, Eastern Orthodox in the East, Greek language in the East, Latin in the West. You have different emperors. Even within the Eastern Orthodox Church, you don't have like a pope in charge of the church. It's just whoever was in charge of the Byzantine Empire at the time, called a patriarch, that was just the head of the state as well as the head of the church. Whereas in Rome, over time, you had both. So there's a lot of key differences, but basically that part of the vision is talking about the Byzantines. Yep. Anything to add? And their most famous ruler was Justinian I, who came up with Justinian Code and built, maybe our listeners have probably heard of the Hagia Sophia, which is kind of like a famous monument that I believe was either for his daughter or his niece. I forget. But anyway, that's pretty much all about the Byzantines before we go on to the next one and the most important kingdom. So we left off here in verse 44, and in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left alone to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. So, and if we were to go back to the beginning, the stone, symbolic of the kingdom that God is going to establish in the new covenant through Christ and Christianity, that stone is going to last forever. It's not going to be destroyed like all of these other kingdoms we talked about. The Babylonians, the Chaldeans, they're going to come and go. The Persians are going to come and go. The Greeks are going to come and go. The Romans are going to come and go. The Byzantines/Romans are going to come and go. But after the church is established in that first century during the reign of the Roman Empire, that's when That's when the only kingdom that's going to last forever is going to be established, and there's going to be nothing destroyed. There's going to be plenty of people trying to destroy it and oppose it, but none of them will be successful because it's an eternal kingdom, and comparatively to these two, it's not meant to be a physical kingdom like
that's what I was going to say.
The Jews were going to think.
Is that one thing we see with the hindsight is that it's a spiritual kingdom, because we see in the New Testament the Jews, even the apostles, were still on board with, you're going to establish the physical kingdom. Yeah. Let's do it. But it really, that's the whole point, that it's not going to be given to a different people, because God has chosen who the people are. Yeah. And but anyway, I was going to point out, Robbie, that it's not physical like these other nations. It's a spiritual deal.
Probably the most important point of it.
Yep. And it's not. You're not conquered by, like, you were conquered by these things. Yeah. And now Christ should be our Lord, Master, and all that stuff, but it's a decision that we make.
Yeah, it's not a forceful conquering. Yeah. I don't really have anything to add on that.
Right. This reminded me, remember, like, I don't remember which season it was, but I think both of you guys were gone for something, so I just did like a solo one. And you were like, yeah, we'll just do like a little mini episode and you can do it. And I recorded it from home. It's like, it'll probably be like 50 minutes. It was like, or it'll be like 15 minutes. I think it was like 50 minutes. This is like, we're going to be wrapping up soon. But I was like, yeah, this one will go pretty quick. And then I don't have time to harp on this, proceeds to harp on this. So hope you enjoyed it, guys. But anything else you guys want to add in?
I don't think so.
Right. Well, as this prophecy ends, it is the most important part, that God's kingdom will last forever. So don't put your hope in these earthly kingdoms, whether that even be like modern day, like America or any other country. Put your faith and your trust in spiritual kingdom, in God's kingdom, and in the church that Christ established. So, but anyway, hope you learned something. But as for Daniel chapter 2, you can consider this the conclusion of the matter.